I suppose you never really know when a single question will unravel everything you thought you understood about your place in the world. I'm 78 years old now, and I've lived through wars, raised children, buried my husband, and somehow kept going when the silence in my house became so loud I could barely breathe. But nothing quite prepared me for that Tuesday afternoon in the bank when my son turned to me with those eyes that used to look at me like I held all the answers, and asked, "Mom, why do you even need savings at your age?" The words hung in the air between us like smoke, and I felt something inside me crack, just a little, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. My name is Eleanor, and this is the story of how I learned that growing old in this world means becoming invisible, even to the people you gave your entire life to. I didn't always feel this way. There was a time when I was young and full of dreams, when my hands were smooth and my hair was thick and dark as midnight. I married Thomas when I was 22, back in 1969, when the world was changing but some things still felt certain. He was a factory worker with calloused hands and a gentle smile, and he promised me we'd build a life together, brick by brick, day by day. And we did. We really did. We had 3 children, Michael, Sarah, and Daniel, and I stayed home to raise them while Thomas worked double shifts to keep food on our table. I remember the smell of his work clothes when he'd come home, that mixture of machine oil and sweat, and how he'd still find the energy to lift the children up and spin them around until they shrieked with laughter. I never had much, but I had enough. I learned to stretch every dollar until it begged for mercy. I sewed the children's clothes from fabric remnants, grew vegetables in our tiny backyard, made soup from bones the butcher would have thrown away. Thomas would hand me his paycheck every Friday, and I'd divvy it up into envelopes: rent, groceries, utilities, and one special envelope I kept hidden in a showbox under our bed. Savings. Just a few dollars here and there, whatever I could squeeze out of our meager budget. Thomas knew about it, of course. He'd smile at me sometimes and say, "Still feeding that showbox, Eleanor?" And I'd nod, feeling proud and a little defiant, because that showbox represented something precious to me: security, possibility, the promise that we wouldn't always be scrambling. The years passed the way they do, in a blur of scraped knees and report cards and Christmas mornings when we'd wake up early to watch the children's faces light up at presents we'd saved months to afford. Sarah wanted to be a dancer. Michael was always taking things apart to see how they worked. Daniel, my youngest, was the dreamer, always with his nose in a book, always asking questions about the world beyond our little neighborhood. I loved them so fiercely it hurt sometimes, loved them in that way that only mothers understand, where your heart lives outside your body in 3 separate pieces and you'd throw yourself in front of a train without hesitation if it meant keeping them safe. Thomas died when I was 57. Heart attack, sudden as a thunderclap on a clear day. One morning he kissed me goodbye and headed to work, and by noon I was at the hospital watching the life drain from his face while a doctor I'd never met told me there was nothing they could do. The children came, of course. They held my hands and made the arrangements and spoke in hushed voices about caskets and flowers, but I felt like I was watching it all from underwater, everything muffled and distant and strange. After the funeral, after everyone went home, I sat in our bedroom and pulled out that showbox from under the bed. 28 years of saving, and it contained nearly $30,000 in certificates of deposit and savings bonds, our security blanket, our emergency fund, our little slice of peace of mind. I held those papers and cried until I had no tears left, because Thomas would never know that our saving had paid off, that we'd actually done it, that we'd built something that would last. The children were adults by then, with lives and careers and families of their own. Sarah had become an accountant, married to a man named Robert who worked in real estate. Michael was an engineer, divorced but doing well, with 2 children I barely saw. Daniel was the surprise: he'd become a professor of literature, married to a kind woman named Lisa, and they had a daughter named Emma who was the light of my life. They all visited, at first. But time has a way of creating distance even when the miles stay the same. Their visits became less frequent, their phone calls shorter, their attention divided among 1,000 other priorities. I understood. I really did. They had their own lives to live, and I was just mom, always there, always steady, like a piece of furniture they'd grown up with and barely noticed anymore. I moved to a smaller apartment and got a part-time job at the library, mostly to have something to do, someone to talk to. I kept saving. It had become a habit by then, Almost a compulsion. Every month, I'd deposit a portion of my Social Security check and my library wages into my savings account. The balance grew slowly but steadily. 50,000. 70,000. By the time I was 75, I had nearly $95,000 saved, and I felt proud of that, felt like I'd accomplished something meaningful. This was my independence, my safety net, my way of ensuring I'd never be a burden to anyone. Then came that Tuesday. Michael had called me the night before, said he needed to discuss something important and wanted to meet me at the bank. I remember feeling a flutter of anxiety in my chest because Michael never wanted to meet at the bank unless it was serious. I put on my good dress, the navy blue one with the pearl buttons, and did my hair carefully, as if looking presentable might somehow protect me from whatever was coming. Michael picked me up in his expensive car, barely making conversation on the drive, and I could feel the tension radiating off him like heat. At the bank, we sat across from a young manager named Brandon who couldn't have been more than 35, with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Michael started talking about financial planning and estate management and a dozen other terms that made my head spin. Then he said he'd been reviewing my finances and thought I should consider transferring a significant portion of my savings to a trust he'd help me set up, something that would protect the assets for the family and minimize tax implications. I sat there, holding my purse in my lap, feeling smaller and smaller as he talked. Finally, I found my voice and asked, "But Michael, that's my savings. I've worked my whole life for that money. What if I need it?" That's when he said it. My son, my firstborn, the boy I'd rocked to sleep countless nights and sacrificed so much for, looked at me with something close to impatience and said, "Mom, why do you even need savings at your age? You're 78. It's not like you're going to start a business or buy a house. This money should be working for the family, for your grandchildren's education, for something meaningful." The words hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, Brandon the bank manager nodded thoughtfully and said, "Your son makes a good point, Mrs. Patterson. At your stage of life, estate planning really should be the priority. These funds could be much more useful to your heirs." I sat frozen in that chair, feeling the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, smelling the chemical air freshener they use in banks, hearing the distant tap-tap-tap of keyboards in the background. My stage of life. As if I'd already crossed some invisible finish line and was just waiting around for the inevitable. As if my life was over and I was nothing but a placeholder, a temporary guardian of money that rightfully belonged to younger, more deserving people. I looked at Michael, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing my son's face. When had this happened? When had I become so irrelevant that my own child couldn't see me as a person anymore, only as a resource to be managed? I stood up slowly, my knees aching the way they always do, and I said very quietly, "I need to use the restroom." I walked out of that office on shaking legs, past the tellers and the waiting customers, out the front door and into the bright afternoon sunlight. I kept walking. Michael found me 3 blocks away, sitting on a bench outside a coffee shop, and the look on his face was pure irritation. "Mom, what are you doing? We weren't finished." I looked up at him and said, "Yes, we were. I'm not signing anything, Michael. That money is mine. I saved it, every single dollar, and I'll decide what happens to it." He argued, of course. Told me I was being irrational, that he was only trying to help, that I didn't understand modern financial planning. But I held firm, and eventually he drove me home in angry silence. I didn't hear from him for weeks after that. Sarah called eventually, and I could tell Michael had spoken to her because her tone was careful, diplomatic. She suggested I might want to think about what made sense for everyone, and I realized with a sinking heart that both of my older children saw me the same way now, as an old woman who'd outlived her usefulness, whose only remaining purpose was to distribute her resources appropriately before shuffling off into the sunset. Only Daniel seemed to understand. He came to visit 2 weeks after the bank incident, brought Emma with him, and we sat in my tiny kitchen drinking tea while I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Mom," he said, "you've earned every penny of that money. It's yours. Your life isn't over, you could live another 20 years. You might need that money for healthcare, for help around the house, for anything. And even if you don't need it, Even if you just want to keep it in the bank because it makes you feel secure, that's your right. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I cried then, relief and gratitude flooding through me, because at least one of my children still saw me as a complete human being. Emma hugged me tight and said, "Grandma, when I'm old, I want to be just like you, tough and smart and not taking any crap from anybody." That made me laugh through my tears, and for a moment, I felt less alone. But the damage was done. The question Michael had asked, "Why do you need savings at your age?" kept echoing in my mind, merging with Brandon's dismissive comment about my stage of life. I started noticing things I'd been blind to before. The way store clerks spoke to me slowly and loudly, as if age had made me stupid. The way doctors dismissed my concerns as normal signs of aging without really listening. The way my older children had stopped asking for my advice or my opinion, had stopped seeing me as someone with valuable experience and wisdom, and started treating me like a fragile, slightly simple-minded person who needed to be managed and protected from herself. I made a decision then. I went back to that bank, walked right up to Brandon's office, and closed my primary account. I transferred everything to a credit union across town, where the manager was a woman in her 60s who looked me in the eye and called me by my first name and never once suggested I was too old to manage my own finances. I updated my will to split my estate equally among my 3 children, but I also set up a special account for Emma's education, because she was the only grandchild who regularly visited, who called just to chat, who seemed genuinely interested in my stories about the old days. More importantly, I started living. I'd been so focused on saving, on being careful, on not being a burden, that I'd forgotten how to enjoy the life I had left. I took a painting class at the senior center and discovered I had a talent for watercolors. I joined a book club and made friends, real friends, with women my own age who understood what it felt like to be dismissed and ignored by a society that worships youth. I took Emma to the theater, to museums, on little day trips where we'd explore parts of the city I'd never seen despite living here my whole life. I used my money to buy experiences and joy and connection, and for the first time in years, I felt fully alive. Michael and Sarah eventually came around, sort of. There was a tense family dinner where Daniel essentially laid into his siblings for treating me like a checkbook with a pulse, and things got heated, but sometimes the truth needs to be said out loud before healing can begin. They apologized, stiffly at first, then more genuinely. We rebuilt something, though it was different than before, more honest maybe, with boundaries I'd never thought I'd need to set with my own children. I'm 81 now, and that savings account has actually grown, despite my spending on art supplies and theater tickets and coffee dates with friends. I think about that day in the bank sometimes, about Michael's question and Brandon's condescending nod. I understand now that it wasn't really about the money. It was about visibility, about worth, about the way society has decided that old people are just placeholders waiting to die, that our needs and wants and dreams somehow matter less because we've got more years behind us than ahead.